Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today. Are you tall enough for the risk management ride? Featuring Brenda Ferraro and Steve Roesing. Steve is the CEO of our valued partner, ASMGi, and Brenda is our Vice President of Third-Party Risk. My name is Peter Schumacher. I'll be your webinar host today, and I've got a couple housekeeping items to go over before we get started. So first of all, this is a reminder that all attendee lines are muted. We do that in an effort to cut down on background noise, especially with many of us working from our home offices. However, in an effort to keep this session interactive, we do invite you to submit your questions using the live Zoom console, so that you'll find that at the bottom of your screen, and time permitting at the end of the hour, we'll address those questions in a Q&A session. So today's webinar is being recorded, and we plan to get recording to your inbox by tomorrow. I know you didn't join to hear my voice, so I'd like to turn things over to Steve. Thanks so much for joining, and please take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Peter. And congratulations, Brenda, for the great recognition and acknowledgments of your recent awards. You know, I just, as I thought about, you know, kind of being on a webinar together, just occurred to me how blessed we are to have a partner like Prevalent, you know, and people like you, Brenda, you know, not only just building great technology and a platform to really make third-party risk more manageable and those kind of things, but also a partner that just really gets it, right? Truly understands third-party risk and brings that expertise to the table. And I think, you know, just a lot of the shared synergies between our philosophies about doing business and everything, just a, you know, a real focus on being helpful and just trying to make sure that we're helping our customers, right? So I'm really excited about the topic today and the webinar today, and just really grateful to be here and just honored to present with you. So thank you, Brenda, for being here as well. And just you know, the accolades that you've won and the awards that you won are very well deserved, I must say.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's really good to be with you here today. This is our second webinar together, so I'm excited to present how-tos. So basically, we've been in webinar overload. Everybody's attending webinars because we're working from home or limited time within the office. And so it was really important for us, as we discussed about this, you know, what is the ride to risk maturity, or what journey is everyone on, or what kind of evolution and skill and technique needs to be used. So I'm excited to present with you to the audience more of the how-to instead of the what should you do, but actually how to do it. So this is going to be fun, and I'm patiently waiting in line for this exciting ride, holding my ticket stub or using my wristband scanner. And so, Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you to start talking about the details. I'm just as excited to present with you and glad of our partnership. So what are we going to be covering today?
Yeah, awesome, and thank you. Thank you, Brenda. It's just such an awesome title and just theme of the presentation, and just, you know, kind of the whole metaphor of you know, being on a ride and being, you know, tall enough and waiting in line and all those things. I think it's a great perspective, you know, as you think through kind of what third-party risk is all about. So today we're gonna talk about, like you mentioned, how do you actually do it, right? How do you actually do an effective program? And it's from an agenda standpoint, I think there are 5 key areas that we're going to really focus on, threat intelligence being one. So what's the best use of outside-in intelligence, right? So I think that'll be a great point. And then just, you know, from a questionnaire standpoint, right, using an inside-out approach, how do you identify and clearly identify inherent residual risk by using those tools and techniques? Risk management in general, I mean, it's a wild ride, to your point, right? So what are the ups and downs and surprises that you bump into when you really focus on getting risk management done, and validation being such a key piece of this, right? And especially today, right? So there are just being able to validate those risks that you find, and, you know, how do you do that today? You know, everybody's dealing with this work from home thing, and how do you do it remotely, which a lot of people have moved to from an audit or an assessment standpoint. So how do you do those without being able to travel on site and those kind of things? And then making risk-based decisions. So every enterprise, at the end of the day, the goals of your third-party risk program are to put you in a position to make a good decision. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit too. So very excited.
Yeah, I took a look at how theme parks used to monitor roller coaster rides. And then in today's world, I looked up places like Six Flags and Disney and Cedar Point, and they have command centers. They monitor the ride, they monitor the cars on the roller coaster, they monitor the weather, especially in Tampa for thunderstorms and hurricanes. They monitor the lines of people and how to flow the people through, and if they have to expand the waves that you have to go through in the, call them the snake waves, and so much more. And this is exactly what's needed for proper risk management. I'm sure you and I can talk about this topic for more than an hour. However, we only do have an hour, and we want to leave time for questions and answers. So let's take a look at the risk management ride in a visual form. So my dad is an architect, giving you a little bit of information about me, and my mom is a teacher. And so what I did was I looked at what a roller coaster ride looks like with the ups and downs, and how do you have to look at risk management for that type of a ride. What are the things that you need to do in order to get to the top peak of the roller coaster? What happens when you're getting ready for the next very stomach wave hump that you go over? And so really we have to look at identify those risks by profiling and stratifying the risk. You may be looking at inherent risk, or maybe your key control attributes by using questionnaires or a vendor tiering approach, or using your threat intel. So we'll talk about all of those. And then of course we talked about verifying those risks. That's basically saying, okay, the outside in approach of using threat intelligence from the outside, it needs to be based on context, engagement, relevant information, so that it doesn't become too much noise. You discussed, Steve, about validation. A lot of companies aren't able to go and do on-site visits anymore. So we're finding new ways to validate risks based on control protocol testing and evidence review. We also have, once we know what the risks are and we've validated them and we've harmonized and normalized those, we want to look at how are we going to monitor them to completion, or if even an event occurs that's going to spike a red flag that would say, hey, come look at me, there's something going on that needs attention. And of course, always looking at key risk indicator reporting and performance indicator reporting to know what tweaks and changes we might need to take. So we all know that there's a systematic method to follow when risk is involved, from identify all the way to report. But all of us have to make sure that those risk decisions are based on the appropriate intelligence and accurate data. So Steve, when you look at this roller coaster of risk, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brenda. And I love this graphic representation that you made. And one of the things that you said, like even as you're climbing up the upward slope of the roller coaster, you anticipate what it's going to be like going down the other side, right? So you form some preconceived notions and various different things. And when I thought about, the webinar today and just third-party risk in general, and what does it, what does it take to actually be effective, right? When you do a program and things like this, and where my mind went, I think we all do this. We all go to places or things that are familiar to us. And I went to situational awareness. I mean, it's like flying a general aviation aircraft, right? That's so when I learned how to fly a plane, I remember my instructor. We had to learn with what was called, it still is called actually, a six-pack, right? And it gives you all the information that you need to fly the plane. There's no question, right? So it tells you what altitude you're at, for example. It tells you whether you're increasing in altitude at what rate, and if you're decreasing in altitude at what rate, or how fast you're going, and all these different things, what direction you're flying in. So you can actually fly the airplane with that information. But I think what people realize, this technology evolved and various different things, like, wouldn't it be nice to have additional information, right? More situational awareness. And you could think about it at like weather, for example, right? So let's say that you want to fly today and you look out your window and the sky's all blue and you say, hey, thumbs up, I'm going to go fly my airplane, right? And then what you don't know is that 20 miles south of you, there's a thunderstorm that's headed your way at 20 miles an hour, right? So in an hour, there's going to be no visibility and a thunderstorm happening and all those things. You don't even know that, right? So it just really, to me, it really mapped very closely to what a third-party risk program is like. A lot of these things are similar in that if we don't, do continuous monitoring or, receive threat intelligence or outside-in intelligence, we just won't even know it exists, right? So, so it was a neat metaphor for me. A little bit different probably, but very similar in that I think the things that are key to making good decisions are the same. And so from that perspective, I think it mapped very closely to the roller coaster ride and third-party risk in general. So if I think about situational awareness in general, there are really four things that occur to me that are absolutely paramount in being able to do it effectively. First, you have to know the risk exists, right? So again, we could treat that like the outside-in monitoring, doing threat intelligence, or any kind of feed that you get from threat intelligence, right? You wouldn't even know those risks exist if you did not have them. So knowing that they exist is paramount and is probably first. And secondly, you have to understand the risk, right? So now when you see that something's happening, you have to know that it's a risk. You have to know what your what your tolerance for risk as an enterprise is, and how you would rate the risk and do all those various different things and position yourself to make a good business decision. And then next, you have to actually do that, right? So you have to take all this information that you have, that you now understand, and you use it to make a good business decision, right? So anyway, that said, this is how we decide, how do we treat the risk, how do we prioritize the risk, how do we rate the risk, how do we do all those things. But then the fourth part is, again, equally as critical, and I think often gets left off, but we have to manage that risk ongoing, right? Just the one and done approach to managing risk doesn't really work, right? The risk could be gone today and then it can be back again tomorrow, right? So we have to monitor ongoing to make sure that new risks don't show up, to make sure that the existing risks that we mitigated are gone, validation of those things. So again, when I think about third-party risk, a lot of the challenges come from this old model, like the six-pack when you're flying a plane, right? These gauges that tell you what you need to fly the plane. It's not unlike having a spreadsheet and moving from the old kind of model, like try to manage third-party risk via a spreadsheet and moving to a modern third-party risk management platform, or leveraging technology to take advantage of new pieces of information and those kind of things. So that's, I think at the end of the day, what really got solidified as I thought through this process was that third-party risk is situational awareness, right? There are just so many parallels there.
Yeah, I think that each of the points you've made are critical to that successful risk management life cycle. And what stands out for me the most is that there are many managed services and platform companies that are available to help mature anyone's third-party risk management program. And specifically in the risk management space, I'm seeing that there are GRCs or IRMs or threat intelligence or standard questionnaire tools that they're all coming to play, and it makes it confusing for companies to know which direction to go, how they intercorrelate or how they talk to each other, and the opportunity to get from that six-pack that you talk about, or get through the description of the roller coaster and belt it in. So at Prevalent, what we do is we like to look at the great work that the companies have in place today as a first how-to, just to perform a maturity assessment to say, you know what, your company is doing something, and here is what we see that might be opportunities for growth and or improvement to your third-party risk management life cycle. And there are ways to manage and measure and make sure that whatever you're measuring, you're managing to the appropriateness of your risk appetite or tolerance. And then another area where two techniques are being used is, in order to have success, you have to first know your vendor universe. And many companies are still trying to figure out who their vendor universe is. And I advise you, don't go into analysis paralysis by trying to get a holistic view of your vendors. You'll have ways of doing that by either going and seeing who you're spending money with, or going to your procurement office to find out if they have a list to start with. but you have been doing assessments. So keep on doing those, but do them in a more methodical and more mature approach, where not only are you identifying the risk, but you're not setting it on the shelf as shelfware. You're monitoring those risks and managing them to completion. Another way is, we're going to be talking about this a little bit more, but threat intelligence reporting is becoming very popular by helping to determine priority of vendors and risks need to be addressed first. So say, for example, you have 5,000 vendors that need to be assessed or looked at for due diligence and proper risk management, but you just don't even know where to begin. Outside-in threat intelligence can give you the ability to see where in the outside world with threat feeds, they're having some challenges. And those challenges, if appropriately contextualized, will be able to tell you, here's a bucket of, or a grouping of, those third parties that need to be looked at first. So you could use that. And then finally, there are now profiling techniques that can help to determine what relevant context information needs to be required in order to apply proper due diligence. So you can internally or even externally ask your vendors or your business units what type of engagement is being conducted. Sometimes your procurement offices will also know this, but you've got 3 venues to go and say, all right, I know we're working with this vendor. I just need to know specifics on, are they handling data? Are they doing services in a different region? Are they in a sanctioned area? Are they going through an acquisition? Things like that can help to determine exactly where you need to go and put your energy towards in efforts to find those risks that matter to you, or your key controls that are being hit up against with regards to working with those vendors. And of course, all of these need automation and a very clear picture of what needs to be addressed, and using a platform that can give that to you is definitely something that you'll want to look into, and we'll be talking about that as well. So Steve, anything else with regards to situational awareness? Otherwise, we will dip into visualization.
No, I think that's, you know, the points you made, Brenda, are really valid. And you know, you talked a little bit about, you know, using platform and automation and you know, threat intelligence feeds. And I just really liken that to, if, for example, if you didn't have a threat intelligence feed that was giving you that outside-in data, you wouldn't even know it existed, right? And so it just positions you better to make a better business decision if you have that information available to you.
Yeah, it reminds me of that commercial, knowledge is power. I don't remember where or what TV station that came from, but it's one of those things that continually pop into my head. What you know is what you can act on, and things that you don't know can be a shock and surprise. So you want to find out whatever you can. So this basic visualization, I want to kind of talk about how we used to see questionnaires being used significantly as a standard methodology of collecting content. And we're now noticing, more now than ever, over the past year or so, that a view of information providing actionable insight with automation is what is driving scalability for third-party risk management programs. So for example, this diagram shows at the very gray circle that it's not only relying on the trust factor of the assessment responses, which is very important, but it's also looking at threat intelligence, including ongoing monitoring. And if we take this approach to a comprehensive profile view, it will include components such as preview risk scores. So there are some companies that can say, here are the high-level risk scores of this normalized risk that will tell you that you may have a vendor that needs to get a deeper dive. And then that will then include reviewing the dynamic risk profile, which will include intelligence from live monitoring to see that holistic picture and have the knowledge in front of you. That's also going to be something that helps with onboarding your new vendors, So you may be using a network or an exchange that repurposes content that has already been gathered and is continually being updated and live to show exactly what's happening with their risk mitigations. But there's this technique now that when you use an industry standard questionnaire and not a proprietary questionnaire, it will simplify your risk analysis across your vendor population, and you can segregate the risks by tier or by category to make sure that not only are you asking your vendors what's relevant, but you're also identifying risks that matter to you most. Now, there's risk reporting, of course, that can be built in and leveraged into compliance registers and risk registers. So say, for example, I've talked about this many, many times over the past couple years, but not every company is following NIST, and not every company is following ISO or both, but they want to see when the information comes to them how compliant their vendor is with NIST if they're a NIST shop, or how compliant they are with ISO standards, or privacy GDPR, or CCPA and the like. And what's important about a platform that's automated is that you use the machine intelligence or the artificial intelligence to tell you, here's the responses and here's how those responses map to those compliance items. Now, and then lastly, the other thing that's really important is the insight from the historical cyber views for threat intelligence, but also the business monitoring events. Many risk scoring companies will give you the cyber and they will toggle into some of the business monitoring, but it's important to use companies like Prevalent that can give you vendor threat monitoring that includes things like BitSite APIs, or Experion, or Recorded Future, and things that have been fed into and already mapped. So many companies will use only cyber, that, like I talked about, but they're noticing that business intel is the missing component for true risk realization. So my guidance on how to for this is make sure you have a platform that can provide you the association and the questionnaire responses of threat intel for cyber and business, and they automate that, harmonize it, normalize it to say, we see a risk in the questionnaire, but in the threat intelligence, it's not showing up. So there might be a deviation and that needs to be normalized. Or we've done a validation exercise where we virtually tested their control and we find that it's okay. So we need to be able to harmonize that risk so that it's not showing up as something that's negative versus it's positive, or even vice versa, a compensation. So Steve, I'm sure you have more to offer on this contextual and automation perspective to risk management. What would be your guidance?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. This is an awesome slide, by the way. There's so many things in here. We could spend the whole time just talking about this, but there are a couple things that really jumped out from your discussion. And one is, and again, this kind of goes back to using the old spreadsheet model, right? Doing the assessments and sending them out to vendors and having them fill it out and send it back, and doing that once a year, right? So one of the challenges with spreadsheets is being able to correlate events and, scale it, quite honestly. But even the composition of the questions themselves, right? What I've seen a lot of enterprises do is, it used to be, we all know it used to be like somebody would ask a question, do you do DR? That was the question, right? And of course everybody said yes, right? And so they sent the questionnaire back in, and we were like, trying to evaluate the questionnaire, saying, okay, they do DR, so we're good. We check that box, right? And then, companies that were doing risk assessments started getting a little more rigorous about that, right? And saying, show us your DR report, right? And then we collect that data, and then pretty soon they're saying, how often do you test it? And let's collect enough evidence so that we actually can experience and be proof positive about the fact that you did DR. Vulnerability management is another example. It's real easy to say, yes, we have a vulnerability management program on a questionnaire, right? Because you have a policy and you have a program, a written one, right? That's signed by the CEO and all those things, right? But yet if you're doing monitoring and doing outside in threat intelligence, and somebody's identifying vulnerabilities. It turns out you're running unsupported versions of OSs on your externally facing applications and those kind of things, right? So then you have an opportunity to say, well, hold on a second. In the questionnaire, you said you do vulnerability management. In the monitoring, it looks like you're not doing it, right? Or at least you're not remediating the vulnerabilities. And so you have an opportunity to sit down with your vendors now and just really kind of sync up on what's the disparity and why is there a difference. So that I think it's, using an automated tool is paramount in being able to cross that chasm, right? Being able to close those gaps. But normalizing the risk is so critically important when you think about the old, kind of spreadsheet model. Everything is in isolation. Everything is one at a time. And if you want to correlate it, you have to pull data together into a common place, like a platform would do anyway, right? So it's impossible to normalize data if you don't have all the data in one place. So that's pretty cool from that perspective. And then just even being able to do analytics on it. How many vendors are in your portfolio? How many questionnaires or assessments do you send out? And how likely is it that you're able to analyze that data? I mean, it's impossible really to scale the spreadsheet model. So I think a lot of the things that I think that are important in a third-party risk program today are not really possible in an old model. So it's pretty cool. I think it's a great slide, Brenda. And I think there are a lot of pieces of information that we could gather, expand on as a result of this.
Yeah, I like how you were talking about control response effectiveness. So you can get responses, but yes, they're doing a control, but how well are they doing that control? So as we're looking at techniques to rapidly identify risks, what's important to me I'll pick up a couple things on the slide. I don't want to talk about each and every one of them, but I want to spend time on remediation and onboarding and outsourcing. So outsourcing, for example, there's situations where you have so many assessments to do and you have third parties and nth party questionnaire content that's being collected and you're asking for supporting evidence all the way through the analysis. And in some cases, risk management is the hot topic. And companies are finding that they have way more assessments than they can handle with the internal staff, and augmenting staff with playbooks on how to treat the risk is important, because you don't want to hand over an outsourcing capability to a staff that doesn't do the business the same way that you do and your team does. So, but more important than that playbook, it's critical that you have a platform that not only identifies your key controls based on your tiers or your categories, but also what are the risk rankings of those key controls? What is the association mapping to standard frameworks and regulatory requirements? And then what embedded risk recommendations are you typing into the platform so that as a vendor, I can find out that I have a risk and here's what you as a company recommend that I do based on regulatory requirements to mitigate it, along with how long do I have? And then remind me that I have something to do, because I'm busy just as much as everybody else. So if you tell me that there's something that's coming and you remind me that there's a mitigation that needs to be done, and then when it's due, if I haven't turned something in, and negotiate back and forth with me with regards to how long I have to mitigate that particular risk. Now, when I say risk recommendations, I literally mean that you want to give the vendor information that they need to know to remediate it, but you also are going to perform, if they're a high-risk third party, a virtual validation. And in your platform, it should tell them, thank you for performing the collection of content and giving us your information. And we've run a threat intelligence report and we've harmonized that. We want you to correct this risk, but also we're going to need to do a virtual visit to test the protocols since you're a high-risk third party. And your reports should reflect to them what you're going to need them to do in efforts to get prepared for that validation. And that's going to save a lot of time and money, not only for you, but for them. Now, implementing a full vendor lifecycle from onboarding and management of the vendors, you shouldn't just be looking at your key performance indicators. You should also be looking at your key risk indicators. And that's going to elevate your program to inform not only your assessors, but also your risk managers and your directors of your TPRM program, executives, and the board on what they should care about. Data can become so cumbersome, and in many cases, it looks like a lot of noise if you have to look at it. So taking that and being extremely contextual and relevant, it's going to help you to have those stories and communication with the executives at least to say, here's what we're seeing. Now, the how-to for me here is to press upon influencing you as an attendee to this webinar to migrate to standard questionnaires, or at least use a questionnaire that has been mapped to what not only your TPRM or supply chain management team needs to know, but also be able to slice and dice that information to share to the departments such as procurement or risk compliance or privacy and others. So Steve, what kind of how-to guidance do you have to share with the audience related to when the time is right to use in risk intelligence or any of these bullet items that are on the slide?
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are some pretty standard use cases where it just makes good sense to use outside in intel. And what we find a lot of times happen in enterprises is like security gets asked, or compliance, or the risk department, they get asked to the train's already left the station, let's put it that way, right? So somebody's completed a project with a custom application developer or whatever the case may be, and then they go back and say, here's the risk rating on this vendor, or whatever the case may be. But wouldn't it be neat if you had a mechanism for like taking a quick look while you're doing the selection process on who the vendor's going to be, right? If you could just do an outside in quick look at what the risk profile from that perspective is. You don't have to even complete a full risk assessment, but you just have some basic information. If somebody isn't within a threshold, they're just out, right? If they don't encrypt their data in transit and at rest, for example, right? Then why would you even use a vendor like that in today's world? So I think, using from a vendor vetting standpoint, early in the life cycle of a new project, when it's going to be outsourced or when there's going to be a vendor involved, is a great opportunity to leverage that data. Also, from a validation standpoint, I think, and you made the point, Brenda, early, how important validation is as part of the life cycle of third-party risk management. But I think if you use outside-in risk intelligence as part of the validation process, so you still want to do, even when you use a platform in automation, you're still asking the vendors questions about what they do to meet certain security controls and those types of things, to provide reports and do this, that, or the other thing. But validating that with an outside-in look, vulnerability management is a great example for that, right? If somebody says, yes, we have a vulnerability management program, but yet they have a bunch of vulnerabilities, it's a great way to say, hold on a second, there's incongruity here. There's something that's not consistent. Please explain further, right? What is it? How do we close this gap? And those kind of things. So lots of use cases about that, integrating with third parties that are doing external outside-in kind of views, and being able to do it yourself. I know Prevalent has got a very robust model and some differentiators, really, quite honestly, in the market, from being able to include business risk and those kind of things as opposed to just cyber, like you had mentioned earlier, Brenda, I think is a great benefit. So validation and early vendor assessments, but then also, I think from a third-party risk standpoint, we get stuck in this once per year kind of mentality, and being able to do it continuously and just throw flags when something happens, right? How do you just kind of having that 24/7 eyes on glass kind of perspective, and being able to throw flags when some indicator of risk changes, right? It doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad, but it means it's something you should investigate or look at a little bit closer, as opposed to waiting until the next annual risk review. So I would say those are three use cases that we see a lot of, and are a great fit for that.
Yeah, I like how you were talking about continuous evaluation. I'm trying to make that concept stick in the ecosystem, because we talk about continuous monitoring, we talk about continuous assessments, but continuous evaluation to me is making sure that you know what the risks are, and whatever comes at you, whether it's a threat intel red flag, or if it's a risk that did not get mitigated on time, or if it's a brand new vendor that's coming in or a change in service, then you want to make sure that you're continuously evaluating the situation. It goes back to your situational awareness for sure. So for inherent and residual risk, what's really interesting is I continue to hear companies not knowing the difference, which you think that we would be grown up enough to know that what inherent risk is that we've got a decision that we're going to use a vendor or a third party or an nth party or a supply chain or whatever that might be. And it's something that we've determined that we know that is a risk for them. Now, once we bump that up against our key controls of what matters to us most, and we're going to need them to mitigate things, those become our residual risks because we know it's something that we're going to live with by doing business with them. And it's a risk that we're going to help them to mitigate or track the mitigation to closure. And then once it's closed, of course, we're going to start talking to them about, let's now make sure that it's mitigated to our expectations and we're all copacetic. Now, the thing that's interesting about this as well is that many companies don't have a life cycle of if a compensating control or if a control standard is not being met to the appropriate risk appetite of your company. There are some companies that don't have business unit owners that own the risk, and it's the third-party risk management company who is providing the business unit the awareness, but there's a disconnect on who really owns that risk, and having to go through a culture change based on that maturity cycle of giving someone the ability to have the authority on, we're going to accept this risk, or we're going to mitigate it, or we're going to go back to the vendor and say, I'm sorry, this is something that has to be fixed before you play ball with us or go on the roller coaster with us, for example. So there's a definite life cycle that any company can put into place. It takes approximately about a month to 2 months, maybe at most 3 months, to put a steering committee together if you don't already have one, or you can repurpose some of the committees that you already have in your company. You may be able to use your risk committee. You may be able to use your privacy committees if they're already in place. But if you have to build one from scratch, the best way to do that is to make sure that you know who are the vice presidents at the highest level that own a particular business unit, and give them the information and the wherewithal to know what's going on in their own areas. Not to slap their hands or give them naughty reports and say, here's how bad you're doing, but more of from an awareness perspective for the first couple months. Here's what we're seeing. Help us to fix that internally, and we'll be doing our best to make sure that we're mitigating those risks until we have the authority put on the right areas. So Steve, what kind of things do you look at with regards to inherent or residual risk?
Yeah, I'm smiling a little bit as you're talking, Brenda, because what I actually see in the market a lot is like trying to ignore the risk, right? It doesn't make it go away. and the problem that enterprise have, if no business owner is assigned to really take control of what to do, how to treat a risk, you really only have three choices, right? You either mitigate it, you accept it, or you transfer it, which means you buy insurance, you deal with it, and insurance is going to pay for it. You carry it on the balance sheet or do whatever, right? But that said, if you don't do anything, it doesn't mean the risk is gone. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you didn't do anything about it, right? So you still have risk as an organization, and I think it's a key point that people are starting to realize today. If we go back to that situational awareness slide, right? First, you have to know that you have a risk, and then you have to understand it. And I think part of that is just understand where it sits on the life cycle of risk and what you do about it. And it doesn't mean that you have to do everything today, because you can't, right? That's impossible. I think what it means is that you have to have a plan in place to be able to treat the risk or switch vendors. I mean, quite honestly, if you have a vendor who's not encrypting data at rest, for example, it's easy for me to say, like, why would you use that vendor? But a lot of people are putting, unstructured data or even structured data in cloud storage, and it's not encrypted. And it almost seems in 2020 like that's probably not a good idea, right? Because there's the possibility that, there'll be some exfiltration of that data, and then it's not encrypted, quite honestly. But there are a lot of enterprises that just kind of move past, I think, the risks that exist, and either manage it by not knowing, or just kind of sweeping it under the carpet. And I think that it's critical to surface these things and have a strategy in place and an owner assigned or committee, right, to talk about them. And it doesn't mean that you can't fix it eventually. It just means that you can't ignore it. That's what it basically means. And so I think for me, that's probably the thing about inherent and residual risk that I see the most.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind when you were talking was some companies will say, if I know about the risk, I have to do something about it, and I'm not prepared to do anything about it yet. And I'd love to debunk that, because I was in the same position at one time at one of the companies of which I worked, and we made sure that the policy was very specific, that said we will be addressing high risks. So at least identifying that there were risks that were low and medium was important, and sometimes those could change. So having an automated platform that would adjust accordingly was critical, but at least letting the auditors know that, and even the internal auditors, not just the ones that were from the outside, to say we are focusing on the high risks and here's what we're doing, and we've identified our key controls, and here's the risk remediation that they have to have in place, and here's the timelines that we feel are acceptable until we negotiate otherwise, is really powerful. And so getting into that power of high risk and what we're having to face with regards to validating those risks in a virtual only world, I put together this graphic to show that there are 7 key components to making sure that you have the ability at your fingertips to conduct virtual assessments or controls for those validations. One of the biggest thing is automation setup. Know what questionnaires you're using, know what packaging is applied, meaning that you may have third parties that are tier 1 or category A, whatever you want to call it, and they may have a standard questionnaire, but you might also have a supplementary questionnaire of document evidence that's required, so that you can make sure that that stuff is all going to the right constituents to complete. You don't want to send a tier 3 or a category C third party everything under the sun, because then they get confused. They're like, I don't even have this information. Why would I even give it to you? So threat intelligence, having those key controls recognized, configuring those remediations, I can't say enough, and including the nth party transparency. We know now more than ever, because of what we've gone through in 2020, that it doesn't stop at the third party. You have to follow the data, you have to follow the supply chain, you have to follow the transportation. There's so many different things that you have to follow. Automated risk summary reports. What that really means is that as you're identifying your risks, and you're very nicely with a red bow giving a risk report or a dashboard to your vendors and your business units or whoever needs to look at it, they should be able to use that as the scoping document for what needs to be tested during the virtual validation approach. So it really says, here's the risks that we found, and here's the ones that we're going to talk to you about, and here's what we want to use to conduct that particular testing approach for the protocol. And so when you conduct that virtual assessment, it will be, of course, that plan, do, check, act approach, but it will allow people to use one platform to give the information or to share the data. Now, harmonizing that with your questionnaires, your threat intel, and your virtual assessment findings is going to be key, because then you're going to distribute that final risk report to the constituents who need to see it. It will give guidance, it will have the right actual intel, and then continuously evaluating and reporting those things to closure, so that you can go to the board to say, this VP is doing excellent in their area, they're owning the risks, they're helping us to close them. Here's what we're providing them on a continuous basis, and then here's where we have our top risks that we need to, as a community, resolve, not only internally, but externally, and share the wealth of maturing. But what do you kind of think of when you see this with regards to the virtual world that we're living in and how we validate?
Yeah, again, I think it's a great slide, Brenda, and I go to the nth party thing, and you talk about this a little bit, but one of the areas that I think is a common problem in third party risk is that it never stops at the third party, like you said, right? And a good example of that is our public clouds, Azure, AWS, Google, right? The three bigs in the public cloud environment. Almost every SaaS application that's out there leverages a public cloud environment for storage, right? So there is automatically a fourth party involved that's housing your data automatically. And so if you only assess your third party, you're kind of stopping short of really protecting your data, right? So every like public cloud or data center environment that exists has a SOC report, and they have user entity controls in it. And basically what it says, that SOC report says is, our controls only work if you do these things, right? And so if your third party isn't doing the things that your fourth party says that they need to be doing, that's a big problem, right? So I think if you tie all this together, and again, what I like is pulling all the endpoints together, and all the data gets collected in one place, and you get to analyze it together. But I think the nth party thing is what really resonates with me as a huge problem in today's world, because almost inevitably there's always a fourth party, right? There aren't many people who do things in isolation or in a vacuum. Most people are leveraging their own third parties, right? Which are your fourth parties, quite honestly. So that's kind of where I go.
Yeah, so it looks like we have about almost 12 or 13 minutes left. So I'm going to go through these last couple slides a bit quickly, but I wanted to make sure that we talked about continuous monitoring and the insights that you can gain from those. In Prevalent, we have the ability to show both cyber monitoring and business monitoring, as I had mentioned before. And we've decided to take that information from a high level that's showed on a screen to making reports that are exportable, that you're able to give to an executive or management that's easy to digest. Because I can tell you, when I started using risk scoring capabilities back in the day, it was really hard for me to explain to an executive what they were looking at. So we wanted to make sure that those monitoring reports are easy to digest, of course, but also you'll notice that in our platform, if you receive a demo, you're able to see the mapping of what brand and financial and operational issues might be contributing to what responses you received from the questionnaire. So we talked about that a little bit more. So it's actionable. We want to make sure that we're looking at things that matter. We want to calibrate the reporting so that it's good and fit for purpose for your engagement and your risk due diligence. So Steve, anything you have to offer with regards to continuous monitoring?
No, I think it's great, but it's worth noting, Brenda, that I think Prevalent does a really good job of pulling together relevant information. And again, if I was going to use the situational awareness and the general aviation piloting, kind of metaphor, you basically have visibility into, are there other aircrafts around me, right? You're getting all this information from threat feeds. You're getting weather information. You're getting GPS information about surrounding aircrafts. You're getting, topographical information about, is there a mountain in front of me, right? All these things. I think that's what Prevalent is doing, and it's unique in the industry. I think it's great to have this level of data available to make good business decisions on.
Yeah, and I think that from your perspective with managed services, as well as helping companies to determine all the gotchas or the ups and downs and surprises of the roller coaster, if you'll notice risk management highlight yellow for those of you who can see yellow, I'm sorry, sometimes I don't think about color blindness, but that all has components underneath it, the universe, the program that you build, the due diligence that has to be applied. If any of those building blocks have a hiccup or something that's not being automated to the approach of knowing exactly what you're using for your risk modeling, or what risk recommendations you need to have applied, or how are you tracking them to closure and harmonizing the risk, It's going to impact your reporting, which then is going to make it very difficult for you to talk to your board or your director of the program or even your business units. So unfortunately, if you use this as a cheat sheet, as a good thing, you will notice that if there's any box that's in here that doesn't have attention to it, it could cause halting or delay or failure to the success of your program. So I appreciate the fact that ASMGi provides services to help you determine exactly where these things might go awry, and then helps you to mature them to build your program so that you are tall enough to ride the risk ride. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, awesome. I just one comment, quick comment on the universe. COVID-19, it's a very unique situation. There's no question, but I think from supply chain and business resiliency perspective, the concept in controlling your universe of third parties from a vendor optimization standpoint, first of all, it's a combination of a security / risk responsibility and a vendor management or a procurement responsibility, right? So who owns that, right? So from a vendor optimization standpoint, I think philosophically that we've seen a lot of the consensus being around less vendors is better, right? Less vendors equals less risk. But today, supply chain resiliency is a huge issue, right? There are a lot of manufacturing companies, for example, they can't get materials. They can't get supply chain because they had a dependency on a specific supplier in a specific region of the world that was shut down, right? So it's a little more complex than that. Like today, there's a trade-off between creating multiple vendors, more than one vendor, in order to have resiliency or diversity in your supply chain, and having less vendors, so you have to manage less risk. What's the right answer? It depends, right? That's kind of the right answer. So it's not a trivial thing. It isn't trivial, but I think this slide does a great job of demonstrating the complexity that people are faced with in managing these types of programs.
Yeah, concentration risk can be a beast for sure. So if we move into risk reporting, automation, of course, is key, making sure that you're in a secure repository. So for example, we at Prevalent have our reporting in Amazon Web Services. So you're not extracting data out of where the secure storage is. We also have the ability to help with augmenting the scoring with the risk intelligence like we talked about before. And dashboards are becoming extremely important for not only your assessors, but your directors and above. And it's showing where is everything. There are so many steps in a TPRM program and a life cycle for assessments that it's critical for us to be able to show you here's where this particular vendor is on all the multiple components that they have, and the touch points and the tasks and the scheduled items and the reminders. And so taking all of that and automating it and making it very easy for you is what we really strive to do so that you can take and scale the business. So I'm sure that Steve, from your perspective, that's helpful from a managed services and partnering perspective as well.
Yeah, indeed. And just being able to have all the data in one place, it's just huge, right? So, we could have a discussion about dashboards that lasted a long time, right? It's very easy to overdo it with data. There's no question, but again, just having access to the data and being able to do intelligent things with it and make sure people have the information that they need to make good business decisions. I think that's really what dashboards and reporting is all about.
Agreed. And so when we talk about holistic pictures, we wanted to share with you that here is what Prevalent looks at from all of the components that can be fed into a platform. Now, comprehensively, this looks like a lot, but we have ways to help you to crawl, walk, and run to your program. Or if you're heavily mature, we have the ability to show you how to leverage everything at once. It depends on your likeness of how you want to go about doing your assessments and where you are with your current program, which I always love to say, doing something is better than doing nothing. And then leveraging platforms and service supports to get you to the highest level of maturity to make things easier for you is exactly what we want to do. So remember, when you're putting your program together, there's just so many components. So one of the things that I look at the most here is industry partnerships, making sure that you're working with a company that has knowledge and subject matter expertise in your industry, because not every industry is like for like. We do share a lot of security controls, but there are some components that are very specific and particular. And then having technology integrations. You're not going to want to walk away so much from your ServiceNow or your RSA Archer GRC programs. And if you're using Prevalent as your engine to do all of the heavy lifting of identifying and tracking the risks, then that information needs to easily API into the different technologies that you already have in use. So Steve, what pops out for you that's important?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that this slide does. One is it definitely is complex, right? And so we said this right at the onset of the presentation. Third-party risk programs are very complex, and to try to do all these things in a manual fashion is futile and painful, quite honestly, right? But being able to have access to all this data in one place, I think, is critical. And what I mentioned, Brenda, about working with a partner like Prevalent and yourself, it just, having that expertise in a domain is so critically important, because there's so much to consider, right? And just enterprises don't have time to consider everything that needs to be considered, right? I have a lot of people that ask me today, what should I be doing, right? What should I do? And I'd love to answer that question every single time, right? But if I did that, that's all I would do. So it's really important to work with people that, that really understand what they're doing. And I think this is a great representation of all the things that need to be considered when you look at a holistic program.
Yeah, and so we're going to go quickly through the next two slides. Basically, here is the benefits of going on the risk ride with ASMGi and Prevalent. We'll help you to stop the pain. We will help you to make intelligent and informed decisions, and we will help you to adapt and grow. And we won't go through all of these components. This deck is going to be available to you. And for those of you who have been listeners this entire hour, you will be receiving the recording, but also you can have access to the PDF. And then finally going into, we love to give back. ASMGi and Prevalent want to make sure that we're not just saying, here are the things that you should be doing, but we also want to provide ways to help you with risk management during the pandemic. We've got a toolkit. It helps you with many items, with questionnaires and videos and templates. What kind of escalation paths do you need to take? What can you do for the training kit for remote working, which many of us are doing, continuity plan templates, all different kinds of things. So this is how we give back, and those are available to you on our website. And then we have a polling question. And maybe some questions that we might have 2 minutes to answer. So back to you, Peter, on any questions that you might think we might be able to answer real quickly.
Thank you, Brenda. I just launched the poll. A quick question: are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program this year? So please answer yes, no, or you're not sure. I'll leave that up, and we'll try to get to one question here before the top of the hour, just so that we can say we at least took a question. A couple of good questions have come, and we'll try to get to those offline. So Brenda, when you're talking about Prevalent and specific, you talked about automating your program, and a question came in during that time. What exactly is automated? Is it the questions being asked to the third-party vendors, or can you expand automation a little more and what that means?
Yeah, so we automate the life cycle, and in using your questionnaire or a standard questionnaire, they have a very easy way to answer those with responses. We automate the chasing of the emails. So basically saying, hey, you've received registration. Hey, you have a survey to complete. Hey, we're waiting for the information, or we're going through back and forth communication. So we automate the emails. We also automate the ability to capture risk recommendations and showing risks automatically. That's also automated. And then we automate the ability to track and create tasks with rules that will allow if-then scenarios to apply within your life cycle that will say, if we have a risk, we want it to adjust to this particular risk ranking based on the tier, and we want the risk recommendation to be this, and we want the recommendation for validation to also be applied. So there's so many different flexible ways based on your maturity that we can automate, and those are just some of the few. The other thing that's automated is the mapping of the threat intelligence for cyber and business that's already been mapped to questionnaires that are standard. And then if you have your own proprietary questionnaire, we're able to map that for you as well, so that you're able to slice and dice the data using machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I hope that answered the question.
Yep. Just
Thank you, Brenda.
Two quick things I would add to that, Brenda. So the other thing is just correlating events, right? So showing those interdependencies, like, so if you can see how one risk affects the other risk. There's a view to be able to do that, but also the compliance side, I think is a critical automation tool, like being able to pull a standard of compliance template, right? So basically, your vendor submits a risk questionnaire, it can be whatever you want it to be, and then you can see where you comply with certain controls based on, standard compliance requirements and those kind of things. Completely agree.
Great, thank you. Looks like we're a little bit past our time, so I don't want to hold anybody up. It sounds like you guys have got plenty of content to fill another hour. Maybe we'll schedule a follow-up webinar. Maybe we'll do the bumper car theme, or how not to throw up after the teacups, or something like that. But this was fun, and I appreciate everything, Steve and Brenda. Appreciate everyone sticking around to the end here, and thank you so much. We'll see everybody on the next webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Brenda. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody.